At this point, characters in Star Trek have referenced so many obscure Starfleet regulations that many are easy to forget, despite how interesting they are when you really think about them. We've already done a list of strange Starfleet rules, so you can check that out if you want to see what we've already covered, but there are so many more obscure regulations, codes, and general orders that have to be mentioned. I'm Bree from Trek Culture, and here are 10 Starfleet rules that you never knew existed. Number 10. The Starfleet Uniform Code. Starfleet's uniform code was not as strict as you may think. Enforcement was largely up to the discretion of the captain, and some officers, like Deanna Troi, were allowed to wear casual clothes on duty, though she was forced to wear a standard uniform when Captain Jellicoe temporarily took command. There were also a number of allowances made for cultural accessories, including Rolarin's earring, Worf's baldric, Nog's Ferengi headdress, and Scotty's kilt, which he wore as part of his dress uniform. Ensign Mesk was even allowed to carry a very dangerous Orion multi-key because of a religious exemption. However, Ro was initially prevented from wearing her earring, so it's possible that these allowances were also up to Captain's discretion. Certain species also needed different uniform styles because of their unique physiology, such as RX from the animated series, the beluga whales from Lower Decks, and Saru from Discovery. Different uniform styles would also often be used at the same time in Starfleet. While the gray shoulder uniforms from the Next Generation films were still being used, California-class ships and others used the style from Lower Decks. During this same time period, Starbase 80 used their own variant that we saw in Trusted Sources, and some styles were used only on specific missions, like the ones from the DS9 episode Shadows and Symbols, which were optimized for hot and sandy environments. Number 9. Academy applications from non-Federation aliens. It was a lot easier to become a Starfleet officer if you were a member of a Federation-aligned species, but the opportunity was open to anyone seeking to join. The difference is that folks from non-Federation species would have to get a letter of recommendation from a command-level officer before they would be allowed to apply for the Academy. Nog, for example, was able to get a recommendation from Sisko in the DS9 episode Heart of Stone, after convincing him that his desire to serve was indeed genuine. Heart of Stone was the only time that this recommendation was mentioned, but it's reasonable to assume that all other non-Federation alien officers, like Worf and Saru, also had to get recommendations from a command-level officer before applying. Starfleet typically doesn't want to exclude people just because of where they come from, but this rule does give an advantage to aliens who are Federation members, allowing them to simply jump straight into the entrance exams before having any real-world experience with Starfleet. Number 8. Patient transfer procedures. An unnamed Starfleet protocol stated that the transfer of a patient is to be performed at the discretion of the attending physician. This may seem like a pretty common sense rule, but it's easy to exploit. In the first alternate universe film, Dr. McCoy purposely infects Kirk with a vaccine for a Melvaran mud flea bite, giving him the symptoms. Once Kirk was infected, McCoy was able to take him aboard the Enterprise simply by declaring himself Kirk's attending physician. No questions were raised as to why a victim of Melvaran mud fleas would need to be taken aboard a vessel that was responding to a distress call from Vulcan. Apparently, no explanation was even required, and the fact that McCoy thought of this loophole so quickly really suggests that he's done this before, or at least thought about it, which raises a ton of security concerns. Number 7. Regulation 3287.0. In the Next Generation episode Night Terrors, there is a brief scene where Data and Deanna were looking through the ship's database of available particles when they came across an entry for antideuterium, a form of antimatter. The entry explained that antideuterium was used as one of the main sources of fuel in the matter-antimatter reaction that powered the warp core, and it also included a reference to Starfleet Regulation 3287.0, which requires all forms of antimatter to be stored in magnetic confinement pods. This regulation is really interesting because it's actually quite realistic. In the real world, whenever matter and antimatter come into contact with each other, they are both immediately annihilated and converted into pure energy. This property makes it very hard to study antimatter, since any container we would use to hold it would be made of normal matter and filled with air that would destroy any antimatter particles that were captured. CERN has actually been able to work through this by trapping antimatter particles using magnetic fields in a near-perfect vacuum. We always love to see examples of real-life science in Trek. It's cool that they put so much thought into something as minor as storage guidelines. Number 6. General Order 5. In the first episode of Lower Decks, Second Contact, Boimler and Mariner ended up getting chased by a giant alien creature while Mariner was trying to deliver farming supplies to the Galardonians. Boimler tried to request an emergency transport to the Cerritos, but Mariner threw his comm badge away, explaining that General Order 5 prohibited them from leaving a dangerous situation if others would be harmed because of it. She argued that the Galardonians needed the creature to be returned to them in order to survive. General Order 5 is probably a good rule to have because it prevents officers from just abandoning people in need or harming anyone through interactions. But much like many other rules we've gone over, it's entirely up to interpretation whether anyone would be harmed by someone beaming out. In the example from Second Contact, they couldn't just stun the monster because they didn't want to spoil its milk, so really the only option left was to lure it back to its cage, which didn't go very well. Luckily though, the creature turned out to be an herbivore, or this episode might have ended on a much darker note. Number 5. Regulation 619. Regulation 619 requires any command officer who becomes emotionally compromised from a mission at hand to resign from said command. When Kirk was marooned on the ice planet Delta Vega in the 2009 Star Trek film, old Spock gave him the idea to use Regulation 619 to take control of the Enterprise back from young Spock and go after Nero. Old Spock knew that his younger counterpart would be easy to provoke after just watching his whole planet be consumed by a black hole. Even with all that Vulcan emotional suppression, Kirk hitched a ride back aboard the Enterprise and basically just bullied Spock until he got angry enough to punch him and slap him against the bridge console. Since Kirk was promoted to first officer by Pike before he was taken captive, Kirk was apparently next in line after Spock to command the ship. Yet, for some reason, no one mentions the fact that the whole reason Kirk was marooned on Delta Vega in the first place was because he assaulted the security officers that Spock ordered to escort him off the bridge. Why was his emotional outburst okay, but Spock's wasn't? Number 4. The warp speed limit. This has been talked to death about, but it is worth mentioning that Starfleet had a warp speed limit in place that was almost always disregarded. In the Next Generation episode, Force of Nature, the crew discovered that warp travel was slowly damaging the fabric of subspace, which could render warp travel and subspace communication impossible throughout a huge region of the galaxy. To slow the process until an alternative form of propulsion could be developed, Starfleet instituted a maximum speed limit of warp 5 throughout Federation space, except in extreme emergencies. These rules wouldn't apply to Voyager as they were stranded on the opposite side of the galaxy, but all throughout the rest of the Next Generation, as well as Deep Space Nine, Picard, and Lower Decks, we've seen starships ignore this limit and go far beyond Warp 5. At this point, most fans assume that countermeasures were developed shortly after the episode, removing the need for the speed limit. In fact, according to Memory Alpha, the third edition of the Star Trek Encyclopedia and an unpublished Voyager technical manual explain that Voyager's folding nacelles were designed specifically to reduce damage to subspace, explaining why they're raised whenever the ship went to warp. Number 3. Regulation 191, or Article 14. In our first video on this topic, we went over Regulation 3, Paragraph 12, which had some really vague wording that left way too much up to interpretation. Funny enough, there's another Starfleet rule from the same Voyager episode Equinox, which was just as imprecise. Regulation 191 states that in a combat scenario involving more than one ship, presumably with commanders of equal rank, command would fall to the vessel with tactical superiority. Captain Janeway used this regulation to supersede Captain Ransom's orders, and he was forced to agree, as the Equinox was a much older, smaller, and more damaged ship, vastly outgunned by Voyager. However, it's not hard to imagine a scenario in which the more tactically superior ship is not clear, causing a lot of possible confusion in the chain of command. Number 2. The Starfleet Draft. It may come as a surprise to some that Starfleet actually practices conscripted service on rare occasions. In Star Trek: The Motion Picture, McCoy, who had returned to civilian life after the Enterprise's 5-year mission, was forced back into service by the Reserve Action Clause in his Starfleet contract, which gave high-ranking officers the power to reinstate officers who had previously been discharged. As McCoy explained, "In simpler language, Captain, they drafted me." The Reserve Action Clause was simply a more gentle term for the same concept. The Starfleet draft was further explained in the Discovery episode Choose Your Pain. Captain Lorca commissioned the work of a former criminal mutineer, Michael Burnham, near the beginning of the series. To justify his actions to Admiral Cornwell, he cited Regulation 13982, which apparently gives captains the power to draft literally anyone into service during times of war. Number 1. Starfleet's alien sex protocols. No doubt, thanks to Kirk's many exploits during the original series, Starfleet actually had medical guidelines on the proper way to have sex with aliens. The Voyager episode, The Disease, gave us possibly the worst Harry-Kim love story in the entire series, and that is really saying something. In it, Harry contracts a mysterious glowing skin disease from messing around with an alien aboard a Generation ship. This disease made him fall more and more in love with her to the point where being away from her gave him withdrawal symptoms. Super corny. But what's actually kind of hilarious is watching Kim get in trouble for not following proper Starfleet alien sex etiquette. After he started noticing his symptoms, he was forced to admit to the doctor that he had slept with an alien, violating the unnamed Starfleet protocol that stated, all Starfleet personnel must obtain authorization from their CO as well as clearance from their medical officer before initiating in an intimate relationship with an alien species. What this basically means is that all because Kirk got a little too carried away in the bedroom, now everyone in Starfleet has to get permission from their boss and their doctor before they can get freaky with a newly discovered form of life. All this is to prevent the horror stories like we've seen in The Disease, and also the episode Unexpected from Enterprise, which introduced sexually transmitted alien hand nipples as one of the many possible risks of making first contact on a first date. And those were 10 Starfleet rules that you never knew existed. If you liked this video, you can go ahead and give us a thumbs up, and if you can think of any other weird regulations that we might have missed, make sure you leave them in the comments section below. You can also subscribe to us here on YouTube to never miss a new upload. You can also find us on various social medias at Trek Culture or at Trek Culture YT. And if you want to find me, you can do so across various social medias at Trekkie Bree. With all that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to live long and prosper.